All right, welcome back to part two of the Cold War review. This is Mr. Kirkhausen again, and I'm going to be taking you through the next part of this little unit on the Cold War. I'm actually going to start out with a map. I want you to take a look at this map of Europe, and I want you to picture that this line down the middle between the blue and the red is kind of the divide between the democratic countries on the left and the communist countries on the right. As we can see over here is the Soviet Union. This is Eastern Europe, and this is going to be known as the Eastern Bloc. These are the countries that made up the communist side of the Cold War. We have the Soviet Union, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. And then, as we're going to learn about, Germany was actually divided up by the superpowers. We have Eastern Germany, and then we have Western Germany. Eastern Germany, of course, was a communist country. And then right in the middle, as you can see above this cursor, this little white dot, that is Berlin, the current and former capital of Germany, which was also divided. So the left side of the city, or the western side, was actually free or democratic, while the right side or the east side was communist. So the whole city was divided in half. So you had a little democratic island in the middle of this kind of communist Eastern Bloc. Then on the western side, we have Western Europe. We have Norway, the Great Britain, uh, Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, some smaller countries, Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And then, of course, we have Western Germany, which was the democratic or free side of Germany. The country today is actually reunited, but from about 1945 to 1990, maybe a little earlier, 1989, the country is actually divided in two as kind of a Cold War casualty. In addition to Western Europe, we also had the United States and Canada. Uh, and some other countries also were involved, but the U.S. and Canada was kind of on the same side as Western Europe. So we have all the blue countries plus the U.S. and plus Canada. You'll learn about the U.S. involvement a lot more next year when you take U.S. history. So I'm going to take you through some key terms that you need to know as far as the Cold War goes. Remember, the Cold War was a conflict between Western Europe and the US versus the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Okay, remember, the Soviet Union, or the eastern side, was communist, and then the US and Western Europe was democratic. So today's big idea that we need to learn about is containment. Okay, I'm going to bring you down through these documents you completed Wednesday. So the first word is the idea of containment, which also you may have read was known as the Truman Doctrine, and it's basically the idea that they wanted to contain communism within countries where communism was already the political system. So it's the action or policy of presenting the expansion of a hostile country or influence. And by hostile influence, they're talking about communism. I think the Western powers, the US and Western Europe, realized they couldn't defeat communism, so they just didn't want it to expand. And a big reason for that was because of the domino theory. So the countries, when they kind of made their plans, they decided that if the Soviet Union expanded and made a new country communist, then that would cause more countries to fall to communism, just like a domino. So they were worried if it maybe seeped out of Eastern Europe and seeped into Western Europe, maybe if East Germany took over West Germany, and then West Germany would become communist, and then maybe it would expand to France, and so on and so forth. So they were kind of afraid if one country fell to communism outside of Eastern Europe and Soviet Union, then more countries one by one would fall to communism. All right. So just as you may have seen, an easy way to memorize what containment is think of a container. A container is something that's used to hold or prevent things from spilling or falling out. So as you know, the Cold War, 1945 to 1991. Again, here are the two sides. It was the USA and its NATO allies. So when they say NATO allies, they mean Western Europe, France, Great Britain, and so on. Remember, the economic system is capitalism. That is that people have free enterprise to do what they want with their money, have their own businesses. They decide what to spend their own money on, how to spend it, and then supply and demand kind of dictates what prices are. And the political system is democracy, so every so many years we get to have our own elections and pick who our leaders are. And remember, the policy was to contain communism. And then remember the other side, the red side, the Eastern Bloc, was the Warsaw Pact allies, is something that I'll get into, and USSR. Remember, the economic system was the command economy. So basically, the government set all the prices up for the items that the people could buy, and there was no uh, supply and demand system. So if people really wanted something, the price wouldn't go up or down. All the prices were set by the government, and the political system was communism, so there were no free elections. Basically, the countries were run by dictators, strong men who didn't really have to answer to anyone. It was all just kind of what they say when there weren't many personal freedoms. Where on the Western side, we have freedom of speech and freedom of religion and so on. Whereas on the Eastern side, basically whatever it was decided by the government was the way it went. There was little freedom of speech, little freedom of press. Okay, so moving on. So the big thing you need to know and why it was highlighted was the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine was named after the president at the end of World War II, Harry Truman. For most of World War II, the president was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR. He actually passed away, and his vice president, Harry Truman, took over. And once the Cold War ended, he decided a new foreign policy for the U.S. would be called the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine basically says that the U.S. will provide political, military, and economic assistance to all nations to protect them from the threat of communism. And the reason we wanted to support all nations and give them whatever they needed was because of the domino theory. So we were kind of thinking if we didn't help the military of Germany or the military of France or the military of Spain, that the Soviet Union might want to jump in and support them, and that would help them turn into a communist country. Okay? So in the Truman Doctrine, the U.S. actually started out sending military aid to Greece and Turkey. It was basically motivated by the idea of containment. If I go back up to the map, the Soviet Union was trying to really influence these two countries, Greece and Turkey, and they made this policy called the Truman Doctrine. We gave a lot of assistance to Greece and Turkey, and it ended up making those countries be friendly with the United States and Western Europe. That's why you see on the map that these two countries are blue rather than red, because the Truman Doctrine, we gave them what they needed, and they remained our allies. Okay? So moving on from the Truman Doctrine, we're going to go to the Marshall Plan. So the Marshall Plan was a policy used by the U.S. to strengthen democratic governments by giving them food and economic assistance. Basically, the U.S. gave a lot, billions and billions of dollars to help rebuild Western Europe, which had been destroyed during World War II. And the idea was if we help rebuild Western Europe, they're going to be friendly with the United States. So George Marshall was one of the people who came up with this idea, and it was not only a way to create allies with Western Europe, but it was a way to open up markets and to basically set up trade. It gave us a place to sell U.S. goods, which kind of helped the U.S. become the rich country that it is today. All right. So we actually spent about $13 billion to these Western nations, which is actually a lot more money today, probably almost into the trillions, to help rebuild their economies. And again, the idea was make them our friend rather than let the Soviet Union become friends with them. So that's where we set up the Cold War alliances. All right. One of the words we talked about earlier was NATO. So the NATO members are essentially these countries that are in dark gray. Eventually, Spain, Ireland, Sweden, and Finland also joined, but these were the free and democratic countries. And the idea of NATO was an attack on one would be an attack on all. So if any of the Soviet countries attacked one of the dark gray countries, so if any of these striped ones attacked any of the countries over here, then they would all have to get together to protect it. So let's say that the Soviet Union, which is here, attacked Italy, then the expectation would be France and USA, Great Britain, Greece, and Turkey would all send troops to protect Italy. And that was the idea of NATO. So again, NATO was the democratic or free countries, and they were the alliance was an attack on one would be an attack on all. It was a military and economic alliance. Now on the other side we have the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact countries you could see here are striped, and it was basically the communist version of NATO. So Poland, Romania, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Soviet Union, these were all the communist countries, and it was basically the other Cold War alliance. So the Cold War was basically NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. Okay, and then one other key thing that everybody needs to know is a vocabulary word called the Iron Curtain. So the Iron Curtain was an invisible line, guys. This was not a real line. You may have heard of the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall is not the same thing as the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain is basically an invisible line that separates the free and democratic countries to the communist countries over here. So basically, if you want to draw an imaginary line down the middle, now I know Greece and Turkey would be on the other side of the line, so maybe you could say the curtain kind of goes like this. It's an imaginary line separating the free world over here from the communist world over here. And again, this conflict went on from about 1945 to 1991. All right. So that is kind of it for part 2 of our Cold War review. Remember, the Cold War was a conflict between the East and the West. The Western free side was the USA and NATO allies, which included Canada and Western Europe. And then the other side was the Eastern Bloc, USSR and the Warsaw Pact, which would be Eastern Europe, excuse me. All right, guys, that's it for part 2. See you for part 3.